The Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution, Article 6, Clause 2, establishes that the Constitution, federal laws made pursuant to it, and treaties made under its authority constitute the supreme law of the land. It provides that state courts are bound by the supreme law. In case of conflict between federal and state law, the federal law must be applied. Even state constitutions are subordinate to federal law. Why does the U.S. have to comply with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights? The U.S. ratified the ICCPR in 1992. Upon ratification, the ICCPR became the supreme law of the land under the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution, which gives acceded treaties the status of federal law. Now, does the ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, apply only to the federal government and its officials? No. The ICCPR applies to all government entities and agents, including all state and local governments in the United States. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights thus applies to government actions in all states and counties, and also applies to private contractors who carry out government functions. When the U.S. Senate ratified the ICCPR, it included an understanding that recognized our federal system of government and specifically stated that the treaty shall be implemented by the federal government to the extent that it exercises legislative and judicial jurisdiction over the matters covered by the treaty, and otherwise by the state and local governments, with support from the local government for the fulfillment of the covenant. When you look into America, the United States of America, and their laws, you see something that's called the Supremacy Act, Supremacy Clause. Now, this is attached to the U.S. Constitution of America. And what it is a clause that brings in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or all international bill on human rights, into the Constitution of America. So the Supremacy Clause brings in the international covenants into the U.S. Constitution. And now the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights become the supreme law of the land in America. Just like we see in Canada, these covenants are the supreme law. Through our Constitution Act, we understand that the international covenants have been brought forth through our Constitution Act. We find this same operation of law, this same principle of law applies in America through the U.S. Constitution by the Supremacy Act. So any American, any man or woman who is residing on America's territory can now stand up on the fact that you have your fundamental rights and freedoms that are recognized by the federal and state governments. Here it states that the United States understands that this covenant shall be implemented by the federal government to the extent that it exercises legislative and judicial jurisdiction over the matters covered therein, and otherwise by the state and local governments, to the extent that the state and local governments exercise jurisdiction over such matters. The federal government shall take measures appropriate to the federal system to the end that the competent authorities of the state or local governments may take appropriate measures for the fulfillment of the covenant. Here's the statement from America concerning the international covenants. The Senate's advice and consent is subject to the following declarations: that the United States declares that the provisions of Articles 1 through 27 of the Covenant are not self-executing. You're seeing that, right? And that it is the view of the United States that the state party to the Covenant should, wherever possible, refrain from imposing any restrictions or limitations on the exercise of the rights recognized and protected by the Covenant. The Supremacy Clause brings forth the covenants into America. And now the covenants become the supreme law of the land in America. Now, this supreme law of the land, these covenants, are subject to something that is called reservations, understandings, and declarations. Now, when you look at what they're talking about, what this means, reservations, understandings, and declarations, it simply means that America would accept the covenant based upon some terms and conditions. So they're saying we accept to be bound by these rules, these terms, but we are going to counter this. We're going to say we have some reservations to what we're going to agree to. When you go and you look at what these reservations, understandings, and declarations are, it simply states that Article 1 through 27 of the covenant is not self-executing. That's what it says. So the government of America accepted the covenants to be the supreme law of the land, but then they put a reservation and said all these rights and freedoms that a man or a citizen could exercise from the international covenants are not self-executing. Which is another way of saying that the only way you are going to be able to exercise these rights is if you study, learn them, and then hold the government accountable. We're not going to go and implement these rights and say, here you go. They're not self-executing. That's really bad in a way, because it says you have these rights, but yet we're not going to tell you, and we're not going to teach you, and we're not going to implement them until you come and say something. Well, that's kind of familiar to what we're experiencing here in Canada. We have the exact same operations of law going on. We have a constitution that is the supreme law of Canada, and this constitution expresses international law. It expresses the covenants. But yet, we have to go forth and say to the executive powers and say to the judicial powers that our rights have been removed, our rights have been abridged or denied, and are not allowing us to exercise our rights. And here the American citizen, the American individual, is placed in the same situation. They have these rights available to exercise. Common law, natural law, fundamental law exist within America, within the law structure of America. However, it's not self-executing these rights and freedoms. The Constitution of Russia, Article 4, Subsection 2. The Constitution of Russia, Federation, and federal laws shall have supremacy in the whole territory of the Russian Federation. The Constitution of Russia, Article 2. Man, his rights and freedoms are the supreme value. The recognition, observance, and protection of the rights and freedoms of man and citizen, see the distinction, two different designations, shall be the obligation of the state. The Constitution Act of Russia, Article 17. In the Russian Federation, recognition and guarantees shall be provided for the rights and freedoms of man and citizen, according to the universally recognized principles and norms of international law and according to the present Constitution. Fundamental human rights and freedoms are inalienable and shall be enjoyed by everyone since the day of birth. The exercise of the rights and freedoms of man and citizen shall not violate the rights and freedoms of other people. When we look to the Russian Constitution, Federation of Russia, we find in Article 2, it brings forth the players man and citizen. It first off starts by saying man, his rights are the supreme value. And then it goes on to further state that man and citizen, their rights and freedoms must be protected, recognized, and observed by the state party, by Russia itself. But it brings forth the difference between a man and a citizen, the difference in designation. When you look to the Constitution of Canada, you don't find that declaration of man or human being. You don't find that title anywhere. When you read the Constitution of Canada, you'll find citizen, person, individual, but you won't find man. When you study the court judgments within Canada, the Supreme Court of Canada, you find that Article 7 of the Constitution of Canada is talking about men and women. It's talking about human beings, because it says the term everyone there specifically only refers to a human being or a man or woman. So Canada brought in our rights but hid it by not directly expressing it. Yet here in the Russian Constitution, when it comes to implementing, recognizing, observing and protecting the rights, Russia's constitution says it directly, of man and citizen. The recognition, observance and protection of the rights for man and citizen is the obligation of the state. So we always hear how, oh, you know, and I'm not supporting Russia, I don't support any country, but I'm just showing you what transpires. We hear that, oh, it's a horrible country, and you know, it's an oppressive country, and I'm nobody's judge. But when you look at the laws of the land, whether they implement it or not, whether they're allowing their men and women to express them or not, they are there within their constitution, and they didn't try to hide it. They used those terms to show us fundamental, natural, foundational law, inalienable rights that attach to a man or a woman, and then subsequent privileges or rights that are attached to a citizen. But in our own constitution in Canada, they hide this fact. They hide it to the utmost. And also within America, they hide this fact that there's a difference between what a man can operate and what a citizen can operate. In all three of our countries, Russia, Canada, America, it's the state party's obligation. They have the obligation to recognize, observe, and protect our fundamental rights and freedoms, or the privileges and benefits that a citizen can express within a democratic society. That's their obligation. The Russian Constitution, Article 17, states that the Russian Federation recognizes and guarantees that the rights and freedoms of man and citizen will be international law, will be the covenants. So the Constitution of Russia is an expression of international law. It's an expression of the covenants. Well, we also know that Canada's Constitution is an expression of the covenants. And that in America, the Constitution of America also expresses the covenants, but they've hid it on you guys. They're not self-executing. But through the Supremacy Clause of America, they are under the international covenants, and the executive government of America and the local state governments of America and local municipal governments, and all these laws are subjected to our rights and freedoms that are internationally brought forth, our fundamental rights and freedoms. So we see the game is the same thing. Our constitutions are an expression of the covenants, and the covenants are a twofold expression. It expresses the fundamental rights of man, natural law, and it expresses the rights, privileges, and benefits of a citizen in a democratic society. The Constitution Act of Canada, 1982. It states Article 52. It states the Constitution of Canada is the supreme law of Canada, and any law that is inconsistent with the provisions of the Constitution is to the extent of the inconsistency of no force or effect. The Constitution of Russia, Article 4, subsection 2. The Constitution of Russia, Federation, and federal laws shall have supremacy in the whole territory of the Russian Federation. Why does the U.S. have to comply with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights? The U.S. ratified the ICCPR in 1992. Upon ratification, the ICCPR became the supreme law of the land under the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution, which gives acceded treaties the status of federal law. We have the Russian, American, and Canadian constitutions, all the same, all expressing that they are the supreme law of the land, and that these constitutions express the rights and freedoms of international law, of the covenants. Now, some would say, well, I don't need international law for my rights to be recognized. My rights are God-given, and therefore I don't need international law. I don't like the UN, they're evil, I want to stay away from them, or whatever. That's wrong thinking. Okay, first of all, whether you like it or not, our constitutions, the way they've been set up, are involved with the United Nations. Okay? That's a video for another day. But starting point to all of this, the American Constitution, the Canadian Constitution, and the Russian Constitution are all heavily influenced by international law through the covenants. Now, the covenants are an expression of two things: fundamental rights and freedoms, natural law, positive law, or values and principles that are expressed in a democratic society. That's what the covenants bring forth. Now, when they went to create the covenants back from 1948 to 1976, they used certain knowledge that men had had. And included in this knowledge to create these covenants was the Cylinder of Cyrus, which they have right now in the United Nations office. Now, if you know what the Cylinder of Cyrus is, it is a declaration that King Cyrus made before he let the Israeli nation go free to worship their own God. So he made a declaration saying that men and women were entitled to such and such rights, and therefore, based upon this, I'm letting the nation of Israel go free. Now, this doesn't mean that our fundamental rights and freedoms come from the Cylinder of Cyrus. There were many instruments that were used that brought forth the covenants. Many instruments. However, the final say to this was the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And these are an expression of the values, the common law rights and freedoms that have been in play for many, many generations, whether they are thought of as being natural law, like just positive laws, or laws that were created from God. So if a man says, I have the right to be free, because the Bible declares I have the right to be free, that would be how one man would say it. And then another man would say, well, I have a common law right to be free, because natural law says I don't have to submit to anybody. They're both expressing the same thing. They're both expressing the same attribute, the same freedom. One is saying it comes from God. One is saying it comes from common law. Now, man agreed that, yes, we should be allowed to have this law. This freedom should be recognized, and it got contained within the covenants. That's how that law got expressed within the covenants. Now, whether you believe God allows you to be free, or whether you believe man decided after experience that a man should be free, that right is expressed in the covenant. And how you enforce it is through the covenant, through holding America, Russia, and Canada accountable. We're not saying that we're declaring that the origin of this right comes from the treaty, therefore, that's not what's being declared. The enforcement, the guarantee of these rights that were in operation long before the covenants ever existed is now in play. So the covenants and the Constitution allows us to enforce these God-given rights, allows us to enforce these natural rights against the executive powers of our government. So if our government is creating laws that are taking away our fundamental rights and freedoms, that are taking away our God-given rights, then we can stand up and say no. For example, anyone listening to this video would agree that no one has the right to be held in servitude, whether it's through an oath of allegiance to the Queen, saying, I, therefore, give and pledge my allegiance to the Queen and promise to obey her laws, and therefore bring in my own punishment if I fail to obey those laws. No one shall be held in oath. No one should have to be held in servitude. That's a positive law. That's a fundamental right and freedom that has been expressed in the covenant. Now some may say, God gave me that right not to be held in servitude. I only serve Jesus, I only serve Muhammad through Allah, whatever it may be. But the point being is that we have the fundamental right to be free, not to be held in servitude. If we want to go into servitude, so for example, if we're a Christian and we bow our knee and we go into servitude to Jesus, if we're a Muslim and we bow our knee and we go into servitude to Muhammad or to Allah, that's a choice that we're making. That's a decision that we're making. But for them to force us into servitude, to say to be part of our nation, you must be under an oath. And once you take that oath, now you're in servitude to the executive powers, or now you're in servitude to a legal crown, for example. Here in Canada, it would be the Queen, Queen Elizabeth II, the Queen of Canada, as she's entitled to. Therein lies the difference. So the covenant allows us as human beings, as men and women, to express that right. No one can force me into servitude. And whether you say my Islam agrees with me or Christianity agrees with me, and this way, that's why I go and take my right. It's okay to say it that way, but if you ever want to enforce it, the international laws and the hierarchy of this world that's governing us right now, they wouldn't recognize it. They wouldn't, or they say, no, I'm sorry, I don't recognize Sharia law. Or no, I'm sorry, I don't recognize your Christian Bible, or whatever it may be. But what they have to take note is the covenants. What they have to take recognition of, remember, we see they must protect, ensure, enforce, never abridge, never remove these rights. And then we stand up and you say, well, hang on. In the International Covenant, in Article 8.2, it says no one shall be held in servitude. Yet your domestic law is forcing me into servitude. You're forcing me into servitude to my local government. You're forcing me into servitude to my federal government, to the laws of my federal government. And when I look at the federal laws or the local laws, these laws are stripping me of my fundamental rights and freedoms, whatever they may be. So the Russian, Canadian, and American Constitution, we know, are an expression of the covenants. It's within these constitutions that we find the obligations that these governments have towards us as an individual. Now the covenants break down the rights of a man, positive law, God-given rights, fundamental rights, common law rights, or the benefits and privileges of the citizen. Now, when they break down the structure, the citizen, he's governed by regulations, by statutes, by bylaws. These are created enactments, created rules and regulations through the government bodies. A man primarily governed by his fundamental rights and freedoms. Now, when I say that, please don't take this out of context to say that I believe that man has the right not to be governed. I don't agree with that at all. For example, within what I share and what I believe, and what the law I have found, my own understanding for it to teach, is yeah, we do have to be governed. For example, if someone steals, or someone murders, or someone does horrific deeds in this way, there has to be a form or a mechanism of punishment, a common law punishment. In this I agree, and this can never be removed from our society. However, the flip side to this is that designating a man or forcing a man through an oath, through deception, for example in the United States, because all of your rights are not self-executing, the United States, through the Supremacy Clause, signed on to international law and said every American that is present, every individual that is present within our territory has these rights and freedoms, but we will not exercise them for you. We will not make the provisions for you. Only if you do your own due diligence and find out that these laws are available for you, then will we have to allow you to exercise them. They put man into the designation of citizen, they create these regulations and statutes, and they try to control, and they try and rule over man through doing that. However, most of these regulations, statutes, and bylaws which they create go directly against or are contrary to our fundamental rights and freedoms. When you begin to understand what are your natural rights, what are your fundamental rights and freedoms, you will begin to look into the regulations, into the statutes, and you will begin to see where they made a mistake, if you will, or where they stripped you of your fundamental right and freedom. And now, since 1976, since the incorporation of these covenants into our constitutions, our rights as man, our rights as woman, our rights as the human being are superior to the rights of a democratic society. Every time you see where the expression of a right is for a man or a woman, it's a choice. It's a choice the man has. You can exercise this right, or you cannot exercise this right. And if you choose not to exercise this right, then you're placing yourself into, by default, the position of citizen. So man is granted the right, and the law declares you have the right to exercise this, and no one can remove it from you. But then the state party comes along, creates a law, a regulation, that actually removes the right of the man. But because the man is not aware that he has that right, he doesn't say anything, and he stays ruled by the regulation. But if the man or woman understood that he had the fundamental right and freedom, he would see their state party, he would see their country, whether Russia, Canada, or America, through the domestic laws, creating a law that is removing their fundamental right, and they could stand up and say, no, you can't do that to me. You can do it to somebody else because they don't know. They haven't learned their rights and freedoms. But you can't do that to me because I understand you have the obligation towards me. I can operate my fundamental rights and freedoms. They are primary now. Here I share many, in my other videos on this channel, I share many court judgments from the Supreme Court and Superior Courts of Canada. And a specific one is very clear to us in R versus Haynes. It talks to us, it says that prior to our constitutions, now this is applicable for America and Russia also. It's the same operations of law. It said prior to our constitutions that we didn't have any power, an individual didn't have any power to enforce our common law rights, to enforce our natural fundamental rights and freedoms against the state party. Why did we not have the power? Not because they didn't exist. As I said before, these rights have been in existence a long time. It's not because they didn't exist. It's because law was set up as this. Government, meaning regulations, statutes and rules, primary. Secondary, the individual. So the laws that the government created, automatically the individual was made to submit. Automatically the individual had to submit. Now check that out and think about that. When we go back to World War II, what we've seen happen in the Second World War, because all these covenants, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the covenants came up after the Second World War. Okay? When we go back to World War II, and we see what transpired with the Nazi regime, with that regime, they began to make laws and say you must be submitted to it, right? So government was making laws and saying individual, submit to it, to the point where they killed if you didn't submit to it, okay? Now, here comes along the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenants, changing that principle, flipping it right on its back and saying no more will the government's laws, will these regulations, statutes, bylaws, whatever you want to call them, whatever they amount out to be the ruling power. Now, and going forth, it will be the individual fundamental rights and freedoms of the man that is primary. And if that individual man or woman catches the state party making regulations, statutes, or bylaws that goes against their fundamental rights and freedoms, then those statutes, regulations, or bylaws are of no force or effect against that individual. That's why when you look in the, more specifically, the Canadian Constitution, and they're all the same, American and Russia, I'm using Canada as an example, Article 52, it says the Constitution is the supreme law of Canada. And then it says any law that goes against the rights and freedom in the Constitution is of no force or effect against the individual. And that's what we're seeing, that expression. And then we see it being brought up in the Supreme Court, R versus Haynes, where it says that prior to the Constitution, the law was structured that the government created law, individual, you submitted to the law, because for the public good, you have to submit to the law. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And the agents of the state, the agents of Canada, the agents of America, the agents of Russia would go out and enforce these laws, enforce the government laws. However, since our new constitutions, since the covenants came into existence, now the flip of that is the truth. It's the individual fundamental rights and freedoms that rules the man's world. My world is ruled by my fundamental rights and freedoms. My world is not supposed to be ruled by the state party's laws. When I interact with the state party, I will be interacting with their laws, for example. And if I go to the government office for whatever reason may be, the government office is controlled by rules and regulations. They have an enactment there that controls the duties and regulations of that office. You may deal with a person who's constantly changing from office, like he works there 10 years and another person comes and works 5 years, another person comes and works 5 years, but the duties are coming from the enactment. So I may have to deal with the government in that way, the state party's laws, when I'm interacting with them, okay? But in my life, in our individual lives, what rules us is our fundamental rights and freedoms. And then if that state party now comes and say, I have a rule, I have a regulation that you must follow now, individual, and I say, whoa, 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 hang on. That rule and regulation is removing my fundamental right and freedom, as expressed through international law, as expressed through the Constitution Act of Russia, of Canada, of America. And you can't do that to me anymore, because now law says that my fundamental rights and freedoms are superior to public law, and you can't force me to submit. And by me saying no, I'm not harming anybody. And by me refusing to submit, I'm not hurting anybody. And that's the beauty that came forth through the covenants, through these constitutions, where now the state party has the obligation to respect the individual. Do they want to? Obviously not. Why? Why go through so much trouble hiding all these laws? The principle was beautiful when you look at it, when you understand international law, when you understand what was created and what was brought forth. It's beautiful. It can operate to the way we need it to operate, but the state parties don't want to, because they want to remain the controlling structure, the controlling factor, the controlling power over individuals. And this is all structured that unless you and I, as individuals, do our due diligence, research and understand, why is there a government? What's holding the government accountable? Where did these rights come from? Where does international law come from? We don't understand any of this. We're not taught any of this in our secular education. So the government keeps us in ignorance, hoping that our ignorance will keep us away from our rights. But if we start studying and start learning and begin to understand what's going on, we can get to the point where we can stand up now and start expressing our fundamental rights and freedoms. Why? Because we see, hey, hang on, you've been stripping me of my fundamental rights and freedoms. You've been creating laws through your regulations, through your statutes, through your bylaws, that have been removing rights that I never even knew that I had. You had an obligation to me, you knew you had an obligation to me, but you still didn't care. You still created the law because you knew that I was in ignorance and I didn't know what you were doing to me. But now I understand that what your law that you created has removed my fundamental rights and freedoms, and I'm under no obligation to obey. And you can huff and puff at me, and you can, even in some situations, may be arrested and taken before a court, but if you know who you are and you understand the laws of the domestic territory that you're standing on, when push comes to shove, when it comes down to the bigger court of your land, when it comes down to the big place of your land, they know that as one individual, even one tiny little individual, 5'2" little woman, she has her individual rights and fundamental rights and freedoms. And if she understands who she is in this law, the state party cannot force her to submit to public law. The state party cannot force her to submit to the public law that strips her of her fundamental rights and freedoms. Now they create public law that does not strip us of our fundamental rights and freedoms. For example, here in Canada we have a criminal code. And in that code we find a law that says everyone who murders is entitled to be punished. A basic paraphrase of that. And that's wonderful. That's a public law. That doesn't strip me, that doesn't strip you of our fundamental rights and freedoms. Not at all. And that's been brought forth here, and that needs to be brought forth. But let me give you another one within that same code. We take a definition from the interpretation section. It says municipality. Listen to this. A municipality means a town, a township, a county, a village, a township, whatever. It's talking about all municipalities. And then it says it's residents who are incorporated, okay, and are entitled, listen to that, entitled to hold property collectively for a public purpose. Entitled, does that mean it's an obligation? If it says that we're entitled to hold property collectively, and the city administrates this property, if it's an entitlement, we don't have to use it. Well, why does the code say entitlement? Why doesn't it say you must hold it in public? Because we have property rights. We have individual rights as fundamental human beings. We have the right to property, the right to private property, and it has to express itself within the code. So yet on one hand I agree with the code, the criminal code here in Canada, where it says don't murder, don't steal, and they enforce these things. When you look at on the flip side of that, you see what's going on. Example again, where it says you're entitled to hold property collectively, then they become the administrators of that. It doesn't say you must. And again, they do it on purpose because the lawmakers, they knew all this. All this that I'm talking to you about, they knew all this. And that's why when you read the laws and you see and you see what's transpiring, it's horrible. Because it can create a really good society. Because there are many who are responsible. There are many who can operate under this. And the more of us who operate under this, and exercise these rights, then the more less there are going to be who exercise these rights.